Some say bourbon is a distilled spirit made from corn and aged in charred oak, but it is far, far more.
It's a beautiful night for bourbon. As always, it's a beautiful night for bourbon. Tonight I'm going to kick off a little bit of a different kind of series and do things just a little differently. I'm still going to taste some bourbons. In fact, I've got 3 of them right here, and I'll get to those in just a minute. This series is going to be called What is Bourbon and Why Should You Drink It? And I'm going to touch on different aspects of bourbon in each of the episodes of the series. Tonight we're going to sort of, in general, define what bourbon is, and then we are going to talk about some of the different styles of bourbon. And those styles are represented in the 3 bourbons that I have sitting here in front of me. Well, first of all, bourbon is an alcoholic beverage. Secondly, it is a distilled alcoholic beverage. Pretty much what you do to make a distilled spirit is to take a liquid that has a smaller percentage of alcohol in it, boil it till the alcohol evaporates, catch that alcohol, and save it. And then you have a distilled spirit. If you distill wine, you get brandy. If you distill beer, you get scotch. Something similar to that. If it's in Scotland, you get scotch. If you distill sugar and sugar products like molasses and so on, you get rum. Agave plants, you get tequila, and so on. So bourbon is part of a class of distilled spirits. And the class of distilled spirits is then called whiskey. That is what bourbon is. And whiskey is distilled fermented grains. So you can't distill sugar cane and call it whiskey. That's not whiskey, that's rum. So whiskey is basically made of fermented grains that have been distilled. But while all bourbon is whiskey, all whiskey is not bourbon. There are some further qualifications. And one of those things is that bourbon, at least if it's sold in the United States and in other countries that have trade agreements with the United States, bourbon must be made in the United States. You can't make bourbon in Canada and then sell it in the United States as bourbon. Not gonna fly. That doesn't mean that some countries that don't participate in trade agreements don't make what they call bourbon in their own countries or get it from other countries. They certainly can do in their countries what they want. But those countries who have trade agreements with the United States will not sell anything labeled bourbon that was not made in the United States, just as you don't sell anything that is called scotch in the United States that was made in Scotland. Only Scotland can make scotch, only France can make champagne, etc. So that's what bourbon is. Bourbon is made in the United States. It is the native spirit to the United States. And it's basically that way because corn is a native grain to the Americas. Not just the United States, but the Europeans and the rest of the world did not have corn until the New World was discovered. And there's some other reasons why corn basically became the grain of choice for distilling in the U.S. and was turned into bourbon, but we can get into that at a later time when we go back a little bit in bourbon history. Now, I said bourbon is made primarily from corn. The mash bill must be at least 51% corn. So it has to be more than half, 51% or more. It could even be 100% corn. So any other grain might be used, and combinations of grains are frequently used in the making of bourbon, but 51% of all of those grains must be corn or more. So at least 51%. Commonly, other grains are rye and wheat and malted barley, but any grain could be used. I've seen people reviewing bourbons that were made with rice. I would assume you could make them with oats or quinoa or triticale or any other grain out there. Then it must be aged in new charred oak barrels. Now there's no real requirement for how long it has to be aged, though there are some restrictions on what you can put on the label and what you must put on the label depending upon the age of the bourbon. You may also not add anything to it. No colorings, no flavorings, nothing like that. So when you are getting bourbon, you are getting a straight grain distilled product that has not been adulterated in any way. There is an exception to that, and we'll talk about that also. There are several different styles of bourbon that have different kinds of mash bills. And I've kind of put together a list of at least some of those styles. There's what might be considered the standard mash bill. This is a mash bill that consists of at least 51% corn, less than 20% rye, and some amount of malted barley. Then there is the high rye mash bill, which is again at least 51% corn, over 20% rye, and some amount of malted barley. Then there is the wheated bourbon, or wheaters as they're also called. This is where you replace the rye with wheat, and typically this would be in the standard recipe. I don't know of any bourbons that I've seen anyways where I've seen the mash bills that have more than 20% wheat. So they might be out there, I just don't know about them. Then there are other styles, and this is kind of a broad general category. You might get 4 or more grains that are used. It could be 100% corn, and you might think that that would be called corn liquor because there is a corn liquor or a corn whiskey. But to call it that in the United States, you don't age it at all. So if you put it into charred oak casks or barrels, new charred oak barrels, you can call it bourbon, provided you followed all of the other rules. And then there are these finished bourbons, and this is that category I was talking about where you can actually flavor your bourbon. Oftentimes after it's been taken out of those charred barrels, they will put it into another barrel that contained some other product, or maybe a brand new barrel that hasn't been charred or is made out of a different wood. I've seen port cask finished bourbons, rum cask finished bourbons, bourbons that have been aged in new oak uncharred barrels, and so on after they have aged in the new charred oak barrels. You have to label it as such, though. You can't just simply say this is bourbon. It must be labeled as a finished bourbon, and what you finished it in should be stated on the bottle in order for it to be legal. Well, tonight what I'm going to do is I've got 3 bourbons here, one of each of those 3 primary styles. I have a high rye bourbon, which is the 4 Roses single batch. I have a standard recipe bourbon, which is the Russell's single batch. And I have a wheated bourbon, which is the Maker's Mark cask strength. I've poured them, I've mixed these glasses up. I don't know which one is which, but what I'm going to do is I am going to try and see if I can guess which one is which, just from the flavor. I've never tried anything like this before, so this will be the first time. I might end up looking like a complete idiot and not pick any of them. Or maybe I will look like a genius, like Matt from ADHD Whiskey, and pick out each and every single one of them. We'll see. We'll start with this one. This has a pleasant, sweet smell, slight smell of alcohol. There's a little caramel there. There's some vanilla. That's kind of what I'm picking up there. It's not really particularly spicy, which would be indicative of a bourbon that uses rye, so the standard or the high rye. This one smells a little stronger. Again, I get that caramel, I get that vanilla. There's a little bit of oak that I'm picking up on this. Seems to have a little bit of that baking spice in there. I can smell some cinnamon. It's a little less fruity than the first one. The first one had a light fruit smell, maybe a light background note of pears or apples, something like that. This one does not have that. Let's move to number 3. This one smells more like the first one, but here I'm picking up a little bit of bread. This might be the wheated one. There's less spice on the nose in this one. A little bit of oak though, some alcohol. Again, a slight amount of fruitiness. So these two had a little bit of fruitiness and less spice. This one had a little more spice. I didn't pick up the fruit. Let's give them a taste. Very drinkable. It's light on the palate. Not particularly spicy, though there's a little bit of heat in the finish and on the back of my tongue, a sort of a black pepper. That second sip is quite sweet. A little bit of honey, vanilla, oak. Very pleasant, what a lot of people might say is smooth, although smooth doesn't really tell you a whole lot. So let's move to the second one. Oh, strong caramel in this one, and I am getting a lot of cinnamon here. A little bit of clove, maybe. Some allspice. I would be surprised if this was the wheated bourbon. I would be shocked. It's very sweet. A little more heat on the finish. Instead of a peppery heat, though, it's kind of a cinnamon oil type heat. And there's some real gentle flavor in here, and I'm thinking it's probably somewhat like something like honey. And a little butteriness. This one it's a little more oily than the first one. I really like the finish. I love the way it rolls over my tongue. The first initial flavors that I'm getting on it are really, really good. I would say that I like this one better than this one. I would be very surprised if this was the wheated bourbon because it definitely has that little rye spice kick to it. Let's try the next one. This one on the palate is very similar to the one in the middle. It's a little more buttery than the other one. It's got this very viscous feel to it. It's really coated my tongue as it's gone down. It's not got the heat to it though. But I am getting those baking spices in here. A lot of caramel. I don't really get the honey here, but I get a lot of caramel in here and corn, and it's got a little less heat, but now I'm starting to feel that on the back of my tongue just a little bit as I've swallowed a couple of times without taking a sip. All right, I want to take a sip of this one again. I would be pretty sure that this is the Maker's Mark. I'm getting, after tasting these two and then coming back to this one, I'm getting a little more bread, a little more fruit, some nutmeg, but I don't get that cinnamon baking spice kind of heat. I'm going to guess this is the wheated bourbon, the Maker's Mark. I'm going to guess that this one in the middle is the Four Roses, and that this one is the Russell's. So let's see how that happens. So we're guessing that this one would be the Four Roses. I'm going to guess that this one is the wheated bourbon, the Maker's Mark, and that this one is the Russell's. So time to see how I did. This one is the Russell's, so it was not the Four Roses. Well, did I just mix those two up, or did I screw up with the Maker's Mark? This one is the Four Roses. So basically the standard bourbon and the high rye bourbon confused me, but I did pick out the wheated bourbon. It was the one that was very different from the other two. So the mash bill does make a difference. You can taste that difference. I couldn't discern the standard recipe from the high rye recipe, but I most definitely picked up the wheated bourbon. Next time I'll probably do a little talking about proof, and then we may get into some other aspects of bourbon and what it is and why you should drink it. But basically, that's tonight's video. For this tasting, I'd like to give a shout out to Chris over at Bourbon of the Week. He recently did a tournament of tasting single barrel bourbons and pitted bourbons against each other to determine which one he liked best. In his finals, he had the Four Roses single barrel versus the Russell's Reserve single barrel, which is why I picked these two tonight. I wanted to taste them, and I wanted to see which one I actually liked better, but I wanted to do something a little different from what he did, so that was part of the purpose of including the Maker's Mark and talking about mash bills. I have to say that this one, which was the Russell's Reserve, is the one that wins for me. I liked it just a little better than the Four Roses. It had that little extra bit of spice, that little extra kick, that little extra bit of butteriness and so on. So I would say that I prefer the Russell's. Thanks, Chris. Catch you next time. If you liked the video, hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel. Share it with your friends. us. Thanks for watching, and y'all come back now, you hear?